Hey, it's a 3.1 video on literary aspects, and this particular literary aspect is structure, the two opposite moving narrative timelines. So get ready to take some notes. Let's go. First of all, what is this literary aspect? Well, it has to do with structure, right? And when we talk about DITS, it's the S in DITS, structure. Structure is simply how text is organized, and so it can be organized into sentences, into paragraphs, into chapters, into large works. And for this particular literary aspect, since we're looking at the whole book, we're looking at how the book has been structured, and we're looking at the narrative timelines and how those two narrative timelines that we have in this book are structured. Narrative timelines are stories happening in a particular time period. And so the way that Ward has organized this book is that she has two different narrative timelines. Most books have one narrative timeline. It starts at the beginning and it ends at the end. This book is not that easy, straightforward, or uncomplicated. Instead, she has two narrative timelines, and they move in opposite directions. What do I mean by that? Well, the opposite moving aspect means that one timeline is moving forward. It's going from the past, moving forward in time. So the earlier things chronologically happen first, and the later things chronologically happen or are described as happening later. The other timeline moves backwards in time. And so that timeline begins closer to the present and gradually moves backwards. So from 2004 to 2000. All right, that's the definition of this literary aspect. Let's look at some examples next. First of all, the prologue, you notice, exists outside of these two timelines. And in the prologue, Ward is speaking as Ward, saying, here's what I'm doing, and this is why. And I find that really helpful. I don't know about you, but after being tricked in some other books we have read this year, it's nice to have a narrator telling us what she's doing and why. And so we hear about the timeline on page 7 of the prologue. The prologue exists outside of the timeline now 7 years after Katrina. She says, Hurricane Katrina takes place in 2006. All right. And so when she says now 7 years later, we know it's 2013. And that is, in fact, when the book is published. The timelines in the book are not that far into the future. The most recent thing happens in 2004 with Raj's death. The oldest thing that happens is the distant past, the great-great-great-grandparents of Jesmyn Ward that we hear about in that second chapter, Delil Wolftown. And so she explains what she does. She tells us explicitly why she is going to use two narrative timelines and how she's going to do it as well. And she does this on the following page, on page 8 of the prologue. She says, because this is my story, just as it is the story of those lost young men, and because this is my family's story, just as it is my community's story, it is not straightforward. I think this is key here. To tell it, I must tell the story of my town and the history of my community. And then I must revisit each of the 5 young black men who died, follow them backward in time from Raj's death to Damon's death to CJ's death to Ronald's death to my brother's death. At the same time, I must tell this story forward through time. So between those chapters where my friends and my brother live and speak and breathe again for a few paltry pages, I must write about my family and how I grew up. So she tells us right there why she's doing it. It's because it's not a straightforward story. And so she's telling it in a way that is also not straightforward, right? And she's telling us that it's the story not just of these men who she's lost, but the story of her town and the history of her community. And then she says she has to follow the men who died backward in time. So Raj's death is the most recent death, and yet it is included in the first chapter as if it had happened, first. But that's not what she's doing, of course. She's talking about the most recent death and then going backwards, following them. And I wonder if it mirrors memory in that way, like, you can remember things that happened better that are closer in time than farther. She'll talk about it later in the book too, and talk about how maybe also a part of why she's doing it has to do with how hard it was simply to cope with that first death that happened in 2000, because it was the person who was closest to her. It was her brother. And then she says here, at the same time. So she has to do something else simultaneously. I must tell this story forward through time. So this is the other timeline, the one that begins in the past and moves forward. So between those chapters where my friends and my brother live and speak and breathe again for a few paltry pages, I must write about my family and how I grew up. So she explains that those chapters where she's writing about herself and how she grew up is in between the sort of main events, the stories of these men who are lost. And that's the part, though, that she's telling forward through time. And maybe that has to do with the fact that she's living her life forward through time, right? The things that have happened to her in the past are further away, and the things that will happen next are closer. And so as her story moves forward in time, she's remembering the stories of the men who have lost. And those stories are in that timeline that moves backward. Okay, I hope that you made some sense of that. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. Here's a couple other things you can jot down. The title chapters will let you know which timeline you're in. So the We Are chapters are the chapters that start in the past and move forward. Those are the ones about Ward herself, her story. Of course, she starts with the distant past, but then eventually she's going to get to her birth and then tell her story of growing up. And the chapters that are named after people, those are the chapters that start more closely to the present, 2004, with Raj's death, and then move backward in time to Josh's death. We Are in Wolftown is the first that's in the forward-moving timeline that focuses on Ward. And that starts in the distant past, describes some of Ward's ancestors and the early settlers of DeLisle. And it ends in 1977 with Ward's mom moving to be with Ward's father years before she was born in Oakland. And then the next chapter is Roger Eric Daniels III. And so one begins in the summer of 2004 with Ward leaving Michigan for the 15-hour drive with her cousin Aldrin, and ends with Raj's repast in June of 2004. And so that is in the second timeline, which is remembering the men, and that one moves backwards through time. Okay, so I hope this helps you make a little more sense of it. Let's jot down some effects that this literary aspect has. I think I've already mentioned some a little bit. But I think some others are, it creates a communal and interconnected feeling as she tells her whole community and their ancestors' story, because it's not just her story, and it's not just her brother. It's the other 4 young men who died, and it's the other young men who died years and years and years and years ago, right? And how it's affected everyone else. It emphasizes the contrasting feelings of love for the people who have died and fear of their loss. And trauma of her memory. So on the one hand, she wants to remember these people because she loved them. On the other hand, the memories are difficult. It's traumatic because these people are gone and she will never see them again. So there is that duality there of feeling. I think it also mirrors the repetitive nature of generational trauma. We have this first chapter called Raj and then, called Roger Eric Daniels III, and then we have another chapter with another name, and another chapter with another name, and another chapter with another name. And those are alternating with the chapters about war, the We Are chapters that move forward in time. I think also this style enhances the ephemeral nature of life and growing up, right? It's not lasting. These are memories. They happened once and now they're gone. And all she can do now is remember and write about them. But it'll never, but even that is not lasting. The book was written in 2013. We are now in 2014. Everything in life is ephemeral. It doesn't last. It focuses on the imperfect nature, too, of memory and the inability to completely recapture it. She tries to remember the men as they were, and she tries to retell everyone's story, but of course, it's impossible to do that. It's incredible what she's able to do in this book, but it really is impossible to do all of those things, right? Okay, that was it. And I gave you a suggestion, too, about the effects of having the two different timelines. One, maybe that as she's remembering, she's going further and further back in time, remembering the men who died. And the other that moves forward in time parallels her own life and how that moves forward. Okay. Think about the themes, how this connects to the three themes, and then you're good to start making sense of this on your own and then sharing back with your home base group. Thanks for watching.